Welcome back
Hi,
to the Climate Classroom.
Welcome back.
I'm Kira. I'm a new member here. I am a senior in high school at our future.
I'm Mikayla, returning from last episode.
I'm Eliana. I'm also from last episode. Do we want to get into that disclaimer? Kira, do you want to read that?
Yeah, I can read that. So before we get into the podcast, we want to be transparent that none of us are Indigenous, and the purpose of this podcast is to learn more about the topic and kind of share our discussions with others who are interested in Indigenous food sovereignty. If you're interested in learning more, we will provide links in the podcast bio to some direct sources from tribe members to get their perspectives.
Awesome. Okay. So we'll kind of go through the eras. We have like three distinct eras, kind of pre-colonial, colonial, and then modern history of kind of like Indigenous culture in specifically Oregon. So this episode is focusing on Oregon specifically. So, Mikayla, I think you're the first one up, right?
Yes, I am. I'd like to note, while we're mainly focusing on Oregon, since different regions historically do not align with state borders, some of my research, and I think your guys' research too, can spread to other states like Washington or California. So a lot of what I found in my research was traditional foods or first foods. So pre-colonization foods that tribes lived off of, both for consumption and also medicinal purposes. So one example is the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. This was from Oregon.gov presentation on traditional foods. And one traditional food is salmon, which is extremely sacred and it's honored in ceremony, so it's essential to a lot of cultural and spiritual practices for tribes in the Pacific Northwest. Berries like huckleberries and blackberries, those were used for consumption and for medicinal purposes, also salmon berries. And there are things like elk and deer. The berries and the meats could be ground into something called pemmican. So it's like a combination of ground fish or meat, fat, and dried berries. So all of those could be eaten on their own or combined.
Awesome.
Wow.
Another thing that I found, I don't know if this is recording video, but I did a little drawing of called a lamprey. I don't know if you guys can see that.
Mm-hmm.
So a lamprey is an eel, and it's an important species for the Grand Ronde people. And so pre-reservation tribes would travel to different streams and waterfalls to harvest eel for both food and medicinal purposes. And Willamette Falls was a significant place for Native peoples to harvest eel since there was an abundant supply of it there. So that's one thing with the last episode that we researched, that wasn't something that we had found as like an important food, but I thought it was really cool because I hadn't heard of it before, but it's very important to a lot of tribes in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I think I've like heard of lampreys before, but I've never like heard of it being in Oregon. That's kind of cool.
I've never heard of that. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So I think to sum it up, the main foods that I found for first foods pre-colonization, a lot of salmon. There's also like different roots like camas root, and then berries, deer and elk, and then lamprey. So each of these foods could be found in different places and were available in different seasons. This is something I actually learned in school. Many tribes practice seasonal rounds, so they would go to one location to harvest something for specific seasons. So like they'd harvest berries, and then they would move on to the next location, and then they would be able to harvest something else, stay somewhere for the winter, that sort of thing. So a lot of these first foods weren't just, oh, they always had like fresh berries, fresh salmon. They would dry it or like make it into pemmican, as I mentioned, so that they could eat those things year round, but they were constantly traveling to find different foods in various seasons, which I think is cool because they weren't taking everything from a specific area at once. They would take some for a season and then leave it to replenish, regrow before they came back. So main takeaways, a lot of those foods were used for medicinal purposes as well as consumption. And then another thing that was very much emphasized in all of the sources that I looked through is that it's very important to honor the sacrifice of the plants and animals that fed them. That was a big part of their spiritual practice, which I think is really beautiful because a lot of times we just like eat food without thinking about like where it came from. And so I think especially since pre-colonization, like they were able to just like hunt and gather for their food, like directly access it. That was something that was a lot easier to do, like directly acknowledging the sacrifice of the plants and animals that gave themselves so that they could eat.
Yeah, that kind of goes into like, Indigenous people often have a culture of using every part of the animal that they kill. And it reminds me of food waste prevention. It's like a really big thing in our future that we like to celebrate, using what we have already and trying to limit waste. So it's great that like we can kind of learn from those old practices and try to limit our waste. That whole idea of like composting, just using the waste that we can't use to create new food. So that's what makes me think of that.
If there's anything else you guys have that you want to add before we go on to the next section.
I think you covered it.
Yeah.
Great. Mine is, yeah,
Well,
mine's focused on policy. So I like to hear like the more like, I don't know, the specifics of like the food and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so this is going to get a little bit more historical as we go into the colonial era. So we'll talk a bit about the Oregon Trail specifically. On January 18th of 1803, President Jefferson created a message to Congress and needed a team of about a dozen soldiers to explore past the Missouri River and find the Northwest Passage. So the Northwest Passage was essentially trying to find a waterway to the Pacific Ocean because at this point, the United States was very like East Coast centric. So they wanted to find that West Coast area. So this trip was took added significance when the Louisiana Purchase happened. So this is when Napoleon of France sold all of his land. He had so much land over in the West, and he just decided to like give it all to the U.S. for pretty cheap considering the time. So Jefferson asked his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead this expedition to the West. Lewis then chose William Clark, who was a military superior, to come with him on the Voyage of Discovery, or the Corps of Discovery. Lewis and Clark is pretty well known, especially in Oregon. There's like the whole college named after them. So their whole Corps of Discovery that happened from 1804 to 1806. So the main goal was to find the Northwest Passage, but it was also to create connections with natives in the west side of the United States. So this was an opportunity for trade and to create a more like hospitable connection with native people. So they tried to get food and supplies from natives while they traded on their expedition. So it is important to recognize that a lot probably wouldn't have the same Oregon if it weren't for the native people that they encountered on their way. There are a few pretty influential Native American people who helped. There was Sacagawea is often talked about because she was able to interpret for them for the like nearby tribes that they were going through. So the Supreme Court then enacted later a doctrine of discovery, which was for the acquisition of Indian land. And this kind of comes from manifest destiny type ideas. And the direct like wording is the United States Constitution recognizes tribes as sovereign governments. But part of the doctrine of discovery claims that the newly arrived United States or European countries has an overriding sovereignty over the sovereignty of the indigenous groups, tribes, and nations. That was from Robert J. Miller, who is a law professor at Arizona State University. He is a tribal judge and an author, so he's kind of this is his field. So they mapped out the Oregon Trail, and in 1830 they had this whole path planned. In 1840 they started moving. A lot of people probably recognize the Oregon Trail from the Oregon Trail game. It's pretty common. Did you guys ever play that?
Yeah. I did like some simulations in like
Mm-hmm.
fourth grade.
Yeah, in fourth grade, we had a whole like history unit. I remember
Yeah.
at my school we had to put textbooks in our backpacks and like walk around the playground and like the school campus, and like they were like, this is what it felt like to walk day after day on the Oregon Trail. So I definitely remember that because they tried to make it as interactive as possible.
Yeah. It's pretty well known, especially in Oregon, because it's a core part of our history. But if you're ever like wanting to learn more about it, I highly recommend the Oregon Trail game. It's kind of funny, it's very informative, and it's fun. So after that, in 1843, there was American and Canadians formed a provisional Oregon government and established the territory law. Towards natives, this was of utmost good faith, shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their land and property shall never be taken away from them without their consent and in their property. Rights and liberty they shall never be disturbed unless in just and lawful laws authorized the representatives of the peoples. So this kind of established the territory, and they were like, hey, to all the natives here, like, you can have your property unless, the whole government says, like, we're just going to take it. But they did, like, start giving rights to native land. I think we can kind of see where this is going. They were like very nice at the start, but slowly we saw a lot of rights get taken away later in the colonial era. So when they made the Organic Law of 1848, which declared Oregon as a territory, they marked out native lands. They gave names to each tribe, and they started making treaties. So there's more like wording here. Nothing in this act contained shall be construed to impair the rights of person or property now pertaining to the Indians in said territory, so long as such rights shall remain unextinguished by treaty between the United States and such Indians. So this essentially meant that the authority of the government of the United States made regulation respecting Native people and their lands. So the United States could take away this, but the government couldn't, essentially. So it had to be a federal decision to infringe upon these rights. But this wording was supposed to protect natives. I know it says Indians in the wording frequently. That's just kind of what they called them back then, unfortunately. That's obviously not correct anymore. India is way farther away than the United States. They tried to give rights, and they said that we must respect native rights, land, and property. Oregon treaties can't take that away, but U.S. government can. Then the Oregon Trail happened. So Oregon is now a U.S. territory, so a bunch of people are coming over to see this new land. And essentially, there was an 1850 donation land claim that said every white man or half breed American Indian could have 320 acres, and if they were married, they could have 640 acres if they came within the year. That is a ridiculous amount of land. And the problem there was that the land for Native people wasn't like a specific area. Obviously, they didn't have mapped out territories because they were, migratory people, and they're constantly moving around, and they had so much like interaction with other tribes. But when all of these people, these American people, started coming over and just like claiming land, that caused a lot of problems. I mean, imagine somebody comes over and is like, yeah, this is mine now. That's like so awful. So I guess we'll like stop here because this is like a good stopping point.
Yeah.
What are your
I think
thoughts?
I think it's really interesting how like the colonies and the people who came from Britain were like so adamant about having their own
Hmm.
rights and like autonomy and self-sovereignty. And then like it's interesting, it's definitely rooted in racism that
Hmm.
they didn't apply that to the people who were already living in the place that they came to in the territories that they settled on. So I think that's like very interesting, and it's very telling that's how what our country was built on is an erasure of like an entire community and like race. So I think that's very interesting. And so moving into kind of the 1950s, I think there's a pretty big shift in how the US government treated native tribes like explicitly in their policy. And so they began to implement like termination policies, which disbanded tribes and also sold their land. And it was kind of
Mhm.
like the end of tribal recognition in this era. So, like, for example, Klamath tribes was terminated in 1954.
Yes,
And
I
so,
looked
like,
into that a little bit.
yeah, yeah. So, like, despite the treaties that were, like, technically, they still had treaties preserving the right to fish, which was, like, a
Mhm.
massive food source and also, like, a massive part of Indigenous culture. Tribes lost access to their land, they lost their, like, political autonomy and power, and they lost a lot of infrastructure that protected these food systems. And another, like, so a very, very important ecosystem and habitat for this fishing was the Celilo Falls.
Mhm.
Um, and so in 1957, the Dials Dam was constructed. And this had been used by indigenous fishers for over like 15,000 years. It's one of the most important sites on the Columbia River, and the affected tribes were given $26.8 million for the loss of Solilo and other like impacted fishing sites along the river, but I don't think it was rooted in consent. It was more of just like we're going to do this, here's your money. And so
Yeah.
this destroyed a major food source for the indigenous groups along that river and also like a major aspect of their culture.
Kira and I both live in Bend, so if you've ever been to the High Desert Museum, they have an exhibit documentary on the dam being built in Slilo Falls, like
Yeah.
ceasing to exist. So I remember, like growing up, I would go there, and I remember watching the documentary and just wondering, like, why that would happen, like
Mhm.
why, because just hearing from the indigenous people that were children when that happened, or talking about how their parents felt since it's been like was is it 70-ish years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think around 70 years. It's hard to do that math.
Yeah, so there's not a lot of people left that remember Celilo Falls before the dam was built, and so
Mhm.
um, not only is it heartbreaking that they lost such an important cultural spot, it's heartbreaking that not many people even are able to remember it anymore. And so
Mhm.
that's like that loss of culture over time because of the actions of the US government. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I came across a couple like websites or like just like articles talking about how like they're trying to remember it and like still keep it a part of like indigenous culture,
Mhm.
although it's not at its prime anymore or existence. And so this now I kind of went decade by decade. So now like moving into the 1960s, although these treaties still exist despite like the termination policies, there were still treaties protecting fishing rights for indigenous people. However, states began arresting these fishers despite their treaty guaranteed waters. So, as a protest, tribes started organizing fish-ins, which was kind of modeled after the civil rights sit-ins. So, Billy Frank Jr. was like a very notable figure in this movement, and like he was arrested dozens of times for like the fish-ins, and it was really interesting because tribes were fishing like a tiny fraction of what non-native commercial fisheries were, and so I think after this movement and the fish-ins in 1969, courts began ruling that tribes are entitled to their fair share of fish,
Mhm.
and so this also kind of led to this is in Washington. 1974, there was like the Bolt decision, which said tribes are entitled to 50% of harvestable fish and they're recognized as co-managers of fisheries. States saw this was extremely threatening to them, and so they resisted it. They told some officials to like ignore the ruling, and this led to like I think a lot of like the lack of like political power that the tribes had, they created intertribal commissions that still exist today. So I learned about like the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. I don't know if you guys are familiar, and they're still working to restore stream flow and fisheries, and it's very interesting how they're still alive today and how these tribes had to kind of band together and like use their collective power underneath the government, who was very adamant in removing their power and trying to like kind of forget about them and their culture. So this is kind of moving to California, the Klamath Salmon Wars in 1978. California banned all fishing, which included tribal fishing. And so this kind of gave federal agents like a, I don't know, legal kind of loophole to start raiding tribal fishers. And so the Yurok tribe was like among like the most targeted. And so like I read an interview with Susan Maston, and she was talking about how in like the middle of the night these agents came and like they used guns and like excessive force to force the families out of there. They'd wake everyone up and say like get out, like they'd confiscate all the fish, they'd like ram their boats. There was a phrase used called can an Indian and save a salmon, which I think it's interesting because I think of indigenous groups as like they focus on using the fish, but in like also protecting the fish. Like a quote that from the article, this is Susan Maston. She said, "Salmon is as essential to the Yurok people as the air they breathe. Fishing is who we are. We're a fishing people, so the health of that river and its resources is the health of our people. And so if the river's sick, the people are going to be sick because our ceremonies, everything, our spirituality, our strength and health is all connected to the river. We're all one." And I think that's like a fascinating quote. And I think it's really beautiful. And I think that is like what we were talking about earlier with like using all of like an animal's body that they're using to eat and like being really intentional in honoring the sacrifice. I think that kind of goes hand in hand with that. And I think that's a practice that we can learn from in how we interact with rivers. So then, do you guys have any thoughts on that before I move into the 80s?
I just think that's so wild. Like, that's such a good quote.
Oh,
Like,
it's
that
beautiful.
connection to nature and culture. Um, I love how purposeful indigenous culture is.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's like my favorite part of it. It's just like so not wasteful. I look at like a lot of colonial culture that we still have because a lot of that came from like capitalism. It's just so
Mm-hmm.
wasteful.
Yeah.
So I love that like ideology.
Yeah. It's like inspiring to me
Hmm.
to like read that. And I will link that interview in the bio of this podcast because I really enjoyed reading it and I think everyone should. Um, okay, so now moving into 1980s, there's some shift in the governmental recognition. So tribes that were terminated previously regained their recognition federally. So like this was the Klamath tribe, they regained it, and a couple of others. And so this recognition meant the ability to defend their land, water, and food rights. So it's kind of similar to what like the California government was doing, or wait, the Washington government did with the Bolt decision. Tribes began leading management of fisheries. They helped reform hatcheries to be more sustainable and helped restoring the habitat because that's a big aspect of protecting the fish and the health of the river. So in 1980, their laws began to acknowledge that fish and power must be managed together. And in order to do so, you need to give power to the tribes and political power because that's a really important aspect of how we moved into the West in the first place. Everything was like policy and like immediately rooted into like having power in government. So it's really important that we give tribes that power. So in the 90s now, there was a lot of overfishing and loss of habitat, and that led to a massive collapse in the salmon populations. And they were listed under the Endangered Species Act, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with. I feel like I hear that a lot. It's been a big issue in like the Deschutes Basin. I think with like the spotted frogs. I don't know, Mikayla, if that's, I think that's the name of, like, I've heard a lot about trying to protect them and like how protecting species goes hand in hand with protecting the river. And so,
Yeah, like I think in the Deschutes Basin it's the spotted frog, but like one thing I learned, I took an ecology class last year, so I learned a lot about this, but salmon is a keystone species. So if you think of like a keystone, sort of like a bridge, there's this one stone in the middle that you take it out, everything else collapses. So salmon
mhm.
are like essential to the health of the entire ecosystem. So if you remove the salmon, then the ecosystem collapses. So there are some species that the ecosystem cannot survive without them, and salmon are one of those species.
Yeah, yeah, and this caused a lot of tension because tribes who rely on salmon as part of their culture, they need it to eat for fishing, like they need to fish it and eat it, but they also need to protect it because it's an important aspect of their identity. And so while the populations were getting dangerously low, there's lots of tensions. And so tribes push for habitat restoration, reforming the dams, and like just accountability because a lot of the overfishing was a lack of accountability in who can fish and how much you can fish. And so this kind of push from the tribes led to like a state acknowledgement of kind of the past injustice. So some of the old like fishing convictions about who can fish what were overturned. I don't have any specifics there. And then in 2000s, there was like the Klamath Basin crisis, and there was severe drought and competing water demands. Um, so 2001, the water was cut to farms to protect tribal fish. So farming lost their rights to water, and that water was going to protect tribal fish. And then in 2002, however, the water was restored to farms, and this caused a massive salmon die off. And I think this is fascinating because when I think especially in Oregon when like an economy is rooted in agricultural and relies on water deeply, it's really difficult to manage that in a way that like we were in a way that protects the river but also protects like these economies and the culture built around agriculture, and how that connects to like the tribal fisheries is really interesting. So the tribes argued that the federal government failed its trust responsibility when they restored this water, and this led to like a long negotiation. And so this was in the Klamath. So now like I think like the 2010s, the Klamath tribes won the senior water rights, which means they have like the first appropriate. It's like prior appropriation, kind of like they win the first in I don't know first in hand rights to control the water. And so they used this legal authority to protect fish, even when this was unpopular among the farms. And the courts ruled that treaty fishing rights included habitat protection, which was a big step because I think when people think of protecting fish, they don't always think that this includes like the habitat around a river and like the plants that are being used and like native plants and how important that is to restoring the stream flow and providing food to fish. And then a big step in this was the Klamath River Dam removal in 2024. This was like the largest in U.S. history, and this reopened like hundreds of miles of salmon habitat. Like it was a massive, massive win for the tribes and salmon. Um, and this kind of, I think, led to tribes like reviving programs like first food programs, traditional land stewardship, and like youth food education. So lots of like grassroots kind of movements and like instilling a care for salmon and like instilling the culture of indigenous peoples with the salmon. So that is kind of, yeah, that's kind of like the conclusion of my history. I don't know, it was mine really long. But I think like there's still definitely change to be made in the government as in terms of like allowing indigenous groups sovereignty over their food, and I think it's deeply connected to water, especially in Oregon with our watersheds. But yeah, I mean, I think the Klamath River dam removal was a big step in the right direction.
For sure. It's hard to like hear there's such a history of promises being made to Native people and then it just like completely falling through. I mean, the amount of illegal policies the US has done, created, and then just not followed through on, it's insane.
Not only them not following those promises, but also like breaking them in often violent ways. Like
Yeah.
Kira was saying, like they would arrest people for fishing, they would damage their property, take their fish. It's not only that they were ignoring those policies, they were also ignoring them in a way that was violent and harmful to Native communities.
It's important to recognize like how little Native people there are now because when white settlers came in the 1850s, not only did they create all these territory like wars, but there were so many diseases like measles, smallpox, dysentery, influenza, and typhus. They all just like wiped out the native population. So you
Yeah.
have all of these like American white people coming in to villages and like slaughtering whole villages. It's like horrific. And a lot of this occurred with government approval. The government was not defending Native people at all. All the stuff we heard about them wanting to protect Native rights is it was a complete lie. Because once white settlers actually came in, all the laws just like went up in the air, you know.
Yeah.
So they were coerced into treaties, and because they were such a small population at that point,
Mhm.
and I think that's important to realize, like how many of these Native people died, and how small their numbers actually were. Like that's a lot of why we see it not being spoken upon because like I feel like especially in Oregon we talk a lot about Native culture and like history, and it's just something that's there, but we don't hear about the new problems. Like, how are they fighting to regain their rights? Because we don't talk about that. They kind of like bury it in the education system. Like, they're like, oh, we're not going to talk about, like, it was just like researching this was so insane to see how little Native people there were at the time of like the Trail of Tears and stuff.
Yeah. I also think like with the current kind of political climate, like our federal government, I think it's really important to focus on like local initiatives and like local government in protecting Indigenous groups because I don't see it being a priority with the current administration. So I think it's really important that we like have conversations like this and like we speak to like the groups like the Columbia, forgetting the name, I lost in my notes, but like just working with like those groups and just saying like, hey, we recognize you, and like we want to like teach this in schools. We want like elementary schools and elementary school kids to be learning about Indigenous culture because I think it's important to kind of grow up with an understanding and like an acknowledgement that many people came before you. Like seeing like the 15,000 years of like that was how long Indigenous tribes were fishing at the Salilo Falls. Like that is mind blowing, and I think it like really highlights how deep their history is and just how quickly it was removed and like erased by the colonizers. And yeah, I think it's insane how small their population is now. And I think it's really important to recognize them and like give them a voice. So that's why I wanted to like highlight the interviews from them in our bio and like,
Yeah,
I liked how you talked about how quick it was. Like it was literally like 50 years that they came, 50 years like they had wiped out native people from their lands and put them on reservations. And it was probably 150 years until they started gaining back their reservation land.
yeah, I know. And I think we need to focus on like, yeah, reconciliation. And it's hard because now all these people, all of the colonizers created a whole new generations and generations, and it's like how can we coexist and just be like, yeah, acknowledge them and like yeah, highlight that we are not the first peoples here. Like we doesn't belong to us. And I think we need to realize that like we need to work together to protect it because we did a lot of damage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. And we definitely want to try and get a guest on here who is Indigenous, who can speak from their experience and their people's experience. So if anyone listening knows of anyone or is someone that would like to speak with us, please reach out to us and let us know. We'll be trying to reach out to people to have a guest, but hopefully soon we can have someone come on who can speak from firsthand experience rather than just from research.
Yes, 100%. Do you guys have any final thoughts or points you want to talk about?
I think we talked about most things. I'm curious, Mikayla, you haven't been able to kind of share your thoughts since for a long time.
I think tying it back to first foods, pre colonization, food sovereignty, I think just that removal of access to land, being able to fish, violence against Indigenous peoples, just that loss of culture is directly tied to a lack of food sovereignty because food, like salmon especially, just is so important to the spirituality and culture of Indigenous peoples. And so by the government taking away those rights to being able to access those first foods, being able to have seasonal rounds directly, getting their food. That's why Indigenous people don't have food sovereignties, directly linked to a loss of access to land, to fishing rights, all of that.
Yeah, especially like the loss of culture is really big because of the assimilation that natives had to go through in order to live. You're talking about all their land is getting taken away while they're on such like low numbers. I mean, we talk a lot about like Indigenous people are finding their culture again, and I don't think people really realize what that means, because there were so few like native people. They really do have to rediscover their culture because a lot of that was lost kind of during the like 1850. Once those white settlers came in, they kind of had to like blend in, so they had to give up a lot of their culture. So like that's like the whole dam removal is like so inspiring that people are like they're actually starting to get that really close connection with their original food source. So I don't know, that's just like there's so much negativity in this topic that it's like so nice to hear a positive and like kind of a win in this topic. So I think it's like important to recognize how awful the history was, but like how far they have come and how much there is to do. But it's nice that we're finally getting those wins.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. One other thing that we can link, there's an OPB documentary that followed following the dam removal. I think I mentioned this last episode too, but it was really beautiful documentary, so I want to highlight it again, where the youth of the Klamath tribe were able to kayak the entire length of the Klamath River for the first time in generations after that dam removal. And so we can link that documentary, but it's definitely worth watching. It's very uplifting, seeing like the joy in that community of being able to access that entire river for the first time in so long. It's like reclaiming part of their culture. So we'll link that, and I encourage everyone listening to go watch that.
I'll definitely check that out.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think that's it. There's a lot of good discussions here. I hope this has like started giving any listeners like more inspiration to learn about these stories because it's such an interesting topic. So yeah, I mean like look at those links that we've provided and start like listening to those stories because obviously we're not, as prefaced before, like we're not Indigenous and we don't come from that culture. So we're just people trying to learn, and we would love if you could learn with us.
thank you guys for listening to our listeners. Um,
We'll see you some other time. Yeah,
Bye.
bye.